Welcome to our Asia Society Policy Institute event, marking the launch of a new report entitled Reimagining the TPP, Revisions to Facilitate U.S. Reentry. This report comes at an important time in global trade policy discussions, with the WTO continuing to struggle, with economic security matters eclipsing traditional trade issues, with our regional trading partners continuing to solidify supply chains through trade agreements, and with China seeking to join the CPTPP and the Regional Digital Agreement. And our negotiators are in Australia this week, kicking off the first in-person substantive round of IPEF, a promising initiative by the Biden administration to step up the U.S. economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And through my post-COVID travels in the region, and I've been traveling a lot, I sense a definite receptivity to IPEF and a commitment to work with the United States to make it robust. But that said, I also regularly field questions on whether there is a scenario under which the U.S. could rejoin the CPTPP. And with this in mind, and growing concern that the U.S. is losing its regional competitiveness and economic influence in this dynamic region, Clete Willems and I decided to do a deep dive into what it would take in terms of specific revisions for the United States to consider re-entering this pact. To be clear, I'm a realist, and I have no illusion that this is in the cards at least anytime soon. But at the same time, I strongly believe this is a conversation worth starting, and we hope this paper will jumpstart this discussion. Our report recommends 12 areas of revisions to the CPTPP, including labor, environment, supply chains, rules of origin, non-market economy issues, and digital trade. And the revisions fall into a number of buckets. Some are fixes to what's in the agreement now, some are updates and modernizations, and some are actually new provisions that weren't thought of at the time CPTPP was negotiated. And in developing our thoughts, Clete and I consulted extensively with numerous trade experts, former officials, and stakeholders from both sides of the aisle, including those from labor, business, agriculture, environment, and other communities. And we also sought input from a number of CPTPP countries to get a reality check on the art of the possible from their perspective. And I personally was quite encouraged by some of these responses. They, like us, recognize that the world has changed dramatically since the U.S. withdrew from the TPP 6 years ago next month. And we look forward in the coming hour to discuss why these developments have led us to believe that restarting the TPP conversation has merit. Now, just a note on the program. We are delighted to welcome Bob Davis as the moderator. Bob has a long and distinguished career with the Wall Street Journal, and he's well known to the trade community for his coverage, along with Ling Wei, of the U.S.-China Phase 1 talks, culminating in their book, Superpower Showdown. And Bob will moderate a discussion between me and my co-author, Clete Willems. Clete and I first started working together many years ago at USTR, and since then, he has served in the White House as assistant to the president on international economic matters, and is now a partner at Akin Gump. And it's really been my pleasure and honor to work closely with Clete through this process. His enthusiasm, sharp policy sense, and unmatched creativity has helped us shape a paper that we hope will spark a needed discussion. Before I turn to Clete, just one more note on the program is that into the program, we're going to welcome audience questions. And so if you do have questions, please insert them in the chat or the Q&A function. Now, Clete, over to you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I really do appreciate the very kind words and the kind introduction. This report and this event wouldn't have been possible without you and with the Asia Society. And I'm really glad to be part of this bipartisan team. I want to start the conversation today by talking a little bit about what inspired me to take on this initiative and to take on this project. And it really started last year when I had the chance to testify before the House Ways and Means Committee on the U.S.-China trade and technology competition. And I laid out a series of recommendations for how the U.S. could better counter China around the world, including recommending that we have a much more robust, offensive trade strategy to try to link supply chains with our allies and partners. And in that context, I made a remark that it would be fantastic if we could take another look at the TPP, but I doubt that's politically realistic right now. And one of the members of the committee, Jerry Connolly, who's a Democrat from Virginia, he said, "What do you mean? Why isn't that realistic? That's exactly what we should be doing." And I said, "Sir, I may agree with you, but there's a lot of things that we would need to change in this agreement." And after that hearing, Wendy and I got together and we said, you know what? No one's actually done that. No one's actually sat down and tried to come up with the list of things that we could change to see if TPP reentry is viable. And so that's what we set out to do. And that's what this report sets out to do. And I think this context is important, this China context, because as Wendy noted, the world has changed since the U.S. withdrew from TPP a couple years ago. And in particular, you see China much more aggressive, much more assertive in the Indo-Pacific, trying to cut trade deals left and right, and including with the RCEP, which is a 15-country tariff-cutting deal in the region, which is the largest trade agreement in the world. And so what you now have is that between RCEP and the TPP as it exists, you have a scenario where it's easier for those countries to link supply chains with China and with each other than with the United States. It's easier for those countries to create standards jointly with China and with each other than the United States. And in my opinion, that's totally unacceptable. And I do appreciate, and I give the Biden administration credit for trying to take on some of these issues in IPEF. And there are some novel provisions in that arrangement. But what you hear when you talk to folks in and around those negotiations is that without market access, there isn't enough of an incentive to really change supply chain decisions. There isn't enough of a carrot to get countries to really do the things on labor and environment that we would like to see to level the playing field. And that's why I come back to TPP. And as Wendy said, this is not going to be easy. This is going to be very difficult. But I am inspired by what we saw with USMCA. We had an agreement, NAFTA, that was unpopular, and we figured out a way to make changes on a bipartisan basis, and that got one of the largest votes in congressional history in support of the trade agreement. And I'm also inspired by the conversations we've had with folks around town, with other trading partners. And it makes me think, truly, we can do to TPP what we did to NAFTA. And I hope that this report really starts that conversation. The last comment I'll make before I turn it over to Bob is first of all, we don't have all the answers. I'm sure there are things in here that people don't like. There may be things people really do like, and everything in between. And we get that. This is really just meant to start that conversation. But not only are we somewhat open to however one would want to deal with this substantively, but I also think the format and the form. And in the report, we talk about revising and renegotiating TPP. But maybe another way to look at this is, can we build on IPEF? Can IPEF be a building block for something more? Or what one person recommended to me was, why don't you just create a new trade agreement with a new name that doesn't have all the political baggage? And those are all great ideas. We don't have the answers, but we hope that we have given everyone enough to start a conversation that's long overdue. So thank you. And Bob, I look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I just want to say, well, a couple of things. One, thanks for the invitation to help launch this report. I really appreciate it. In my career reporting on trade, far too much was taken up, I would say, with the TPP, but it was a worthwhile effort, to say the least. I thought the way it's structured, the questions would be to ask about kind of the practicalities of it first, and then get into the specifics, because if it's not kind of practical, doesn't in a sense doesn't really matter what you're proposing. So Wendy, I thought I'd start with you. I mean, also I should say a couple other things about the report. One, that it is really a bipartisan effort. I mean, Clete, as you know, was a senior trade person in the Trump White House, which obviously took a very different approach toward trade than previous administrations. Wendy served in any number of administrations, but is best known, I think, as a negotiator for TPP and for the Korea Free Trade Agreement, which both were under the Obama administration. So you had a Democrat and a Republican working together on this. That's nice to see in Washington, these days. And the other is it's just a really good report. I mean, the recommendations are very interesting, but in addition to that, it brings the reader up to date with a dozen different areas. Like, so where are we in the TPP? Where did the TPP end off? Where did the USMCA cut in? What about the Japan deal? It's really quite worth reading and very crisply written, I must say, as an editor. I appreciated that part very much as well. So Wendy, let's start with you. I mean, thinking about the Biden administration, you have an administration here that hasn't even come up with a China trade strategy in particular, right? It won't even say whether it will continue the Trump tariffs and how it would distinguish itself from Trump. So why, if you have an administration that is so concerned about taking trade liberalization steps, why would you think that they might be interested in, something as far-reaching as essentially reviving the TPP?
Well, that's a great question. And I think I would respond by pointing to IPEF. Like Bob, you pointed to areas where they haven't moved, but I think one area where they have moved because they recognize the importance of being economically engaged is in the Indo-Pacific region. So they've put forth an initiative, as I mentioned, negotiations underway as we speak. And in the IPEF, there is a strong trade component. Now, what they've chosen to put in the trade pillar is really kind of a subset of what's in comprehensive free trade agreements. But I would argue, that's moving forward. And so that would be my initial response. But second, the administration is focused on U.S. competitiveness globally. And I think that we are becoming less and less competitive in the region. And one thing that people don't appreciate is through the existing CPTPP, not only do we lose from tariff cuts between the partners, but every year those tariff cuts are being cut further and further. So every year with this tariff staging, our competitiveness in the region erodes. And so with that factor, with the China factor that Clete mentioned as well, I think there are compelling reasons to start thinking about the TPP again. But again, I recognize that this administration has been allergic so far to trade agreements. 2 years in, maybe that will change. And maybe the IPEF, as Clete mentioned, could be a step towards somehow thinking about the TPP in a more forward-leaning manner.
And Clete, let me ask you the same sort of question. Obviously, you worked for President Trump. He put the final dagger in the heart of TPP for the United States. He campaigned against it. One of the first things he did as president. If he comes out again and restates his opposition to it, I would imagine that would freeze a lot of Republicans, let alone Democrats who also have opposed TPP. So what do you see as a possible road forward, given all that?
Sure. I'm very encouraged with the conversations that I've had on the Hill, especially on the Republican side, about this issue. And if you saw some of the hearings last year in Ways and Means and Finance on the IPEF, there was almost a constant refrain from Republicans that, hey, where's the market access? Where are the export opportunities for our manufacturers, for our agricultural producers? We need that. We want to see that. And so you really have an interest in the Republican Party in Congress and having a more robust, more proactive offensive trade agenda. So you have that. Now, with respect to this deal in particular, I do think your question and your comments about President Trump are relevant. And I will say, though, that spending time in the Oval Office with the president talking about this, there were more than one occasion where he said something to the effect of, what do you think? Was it a mistake to withdraw from TPP? And I'll repeat what I said then, which was, look, there were problems with the agreement. I think we all need to acknowledge that. But the best way forward is to renegotiate and to try to fix those problems. And that's exactly what we've tried to do here. Bob Lighthizer had written an op-ed a couple months ago where he outlines basically 7 problems with TPP. He looks at rules of origin, labor environment, the lack of currency provisions, and we go through the list and we address all of those things. And I think from a Republican perspective, what we're trying to do is capture the essence of what was good about the TPP, fix it in the same way that Lighthizer and Trump and others fixed fixed NAFTA and yielded USMCA. And I think ultimately that is something that could be viable for Republicans. Now, just the last point is to, Wendy's point about the Biden administration. I think all of us see this as a longer term project. I even in my most optimistic half glass full moments, I don't think we're doing this next week, right? I think the point is, let's start a conversation. Let's really look at the substance and see if we can make this work for our economic and national security interests.
So you both talked about IPEF in a positive fashion, and I the way I look at it basically is a number of administration priorities that it's trying to recruit Asian nations to get behind infrastructure, digital trade, things of that sort. And there aren't any number of people in the White House, as you both know, who would love that to lead to rejoining TPP. But equally, there are any number of activists who are entirely suspicious of IPEF as a road back to TPP. So I wondered kind of how you, Clete, you said it's not something for tomorrow, and I get that, right? But we live in a political world, and so we just got through the midterms, then we're going to go to presidential election, then we're going to go to midterms, and so on and so forth. Wendy, what about on your end? Do you see a way? I'm sure you can see intellectually or logically how IPEF could lead to CPTPP rejoining, but how do you see it working politically? What would you expect? How would you expect one to go into the other? How would you kind of imagine that?
So, just to take a broader response to your question, I think we really need to keep in mind how the USMCA transformed NAFTA into something that received overwhelming, unprecedented support from both sides of the aisle, including Democrats who had never voted for a trade agreement before. And when you look at some of the recommendations we make, guess what? They look familiar. We have drawn many of our ideas from the USMCA, but we've also drawn them from IPEF without knowing the exact substance, but at least knowing where IPEF is headed. So I think if folks look at the recommendations that we've put forward and take a deep breath, it looks like at the end of the day, this could look like a different agreement, which, really reflects U.S. economic and national security interests.
And Bob, if I could jump in on that, I think Wendy makes an excellent point here. And in my opening remarks, I talked about some of the things that are lacking in IPEF and which I think are going to ultimately hold the agreement back. But there actually is some stuff in there that's quite good, or at least we believe will be quite good. And I think the idea is that we would build on that in our recommendations and in our path back to TPP. And just to give you some more specific examples, one of the things we recommend in the report is updating and modernizing the digital chapter. The digital chapter in TPP was negotiated back in 2012, 2013, 2014. We've moved the ball forward since then. As I understand it, the administration is trying to work with that in IPEF. And so IPEF in a way would be paving the path. Same thing on labor and the environment. They're trying to have more ambitious standards there. So they're paving the path. And I think that that's where this comes in. And the other one is the supply chain chapter, right? One of the things we recommend here is a new supply chain chapter, and maybe the conversation in IPEF paves the path. So we see this as complementary to some of those ongoing efforts.
Clete, if I can just add on digital too, we're not only looking at like advancing, what we know to be in other digital agreements in the region, but we're also very interested in promoting digital inclusiveness and making sure the digital economy works for small and medium-sized enterprises, for consumers, for workers. And in that regard, I think we're going to see a lot of innovations when the U.S. tables its text on digital in the IPEF going forward. And our view would be those are the types of things that we should draw from as well into any, new TPP and go forward with that. And we think that could help build support from, folks who you rightfully point to as either objecting or skeptical.
You both pointed to one of the big differences politically being the emergence of China. China's been emerging for so long. I mean, the influence of the China debate on trade. I mean, I also have talked to people on the Hill who I would have been surprised actually talking about trade liberal. They would have two responses. First of all, people who I would be surprised that would be for trade liberalization, I would say something like, well, you can never get a trade deal through or something like that. And they say, well, with China these days, maybe we should. And then I'd say, well, what about TPP? And they say, oh, no, because TPP was sort of poisonous. So I wondered, the impact of China on this. I mean, obviously, it kind of shakes up the politics. But Wendy, I was wondering, maybe we start with you, as a longtime trade negotiator. China has applied to join the CPTPP, but, a lot of people don't take that particularly seriously, that, Japan's never going to let them in, Australia's never going to let them in. So what's the significance, if any, of China trying to join, or at least, putting in an application to join the trade pact?
Well, in my view, China's application to join the CPTPP is serious and should be taken seriously. I get it. And, in many ways, I don't see how China could live up to any of the current provisions with respect to state-owned enterprises, labor, digital, IPR, et cetera. But then the question is, what is China's game here? And is it to actually join CPTPP? Or is it to start the process and get its nose under the tent and start influencing the direction of CPTPP? And so I think we need to take it seriously. Also, the current CPTPP members now are focused on getting the UK into the agreement, and they're working hard on UK accession, something we can get to as well, because I think that also could make the TPP more interesting to the United States. But once they're done with that process, then all eyes are going to turn to how do they deal with China and Taiwan, as well as others. And I think there is a real difference in views among CPTPP members on how to treat these new applicants. And so I think this is something we need to take seriously. We shouldn't focus on the end game of whether they get in or they don't. I think it's more kind of getting that nose under the tent. And let's keep in mind, for most CPTPP members, guess who their number one trading partner is? It's China. And so China has ways to pressure countries to ensure that they kind of side with them going forward. So I think this is going to be kind of a tough issue on the CPTPP agenda next year for all of CPTPP members.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this real quick, Bob, and just make the point. I think Wendy said it well, but let me just say something very directly, which is we should not think of TPP or CPTPP as a static agreement. This is an agreement where the benefits to us will continue to grow. You look at the UK likely going to join this agreement in the next couple months. And the UK is a country where you have strong bipartisan support in favor of a trade agreement. And so I think having them in there will make this even more attractive. But the risks also grow. And I think taking China's bid seriously is important for U.S. policymakers. We need to get in there ahead of them. I think our friends are helping us slow that process down, but at some point, it's going to become very difficult for them. And we need to get in there before China can. And as we get to the detailed recommendations, I'll just mention now, and one of the things we recommend is that in our implementing legislation to theoretically rejoin the CPTPP, we would have a provision state clearly that the U.S. will not permit China to join at a later date and will take efforts to block their accession. I think it would be troubling for us both to not take their bid seriously, and it would also be troubling for us once we were in to let them in until they've shown a totally different approach to trade than they have in the past.
I thought your proposal on that one was in the implementing legislation to say the U.S. would withdraw if China joined.
That's right, Bob. That's right. I mean, it's unacceptable for the U.S. to have a situation where China isn't in a deal like this and where we're a party. And I think that was something that we got loud and clear from some of the folks we consulted with and wanted to make sure that was reflected in the report.
So let's get
if we're in TPP before China, we have veto power as well. So let's keep that in mind.
Sure. Although you get, I suppose, as Clete said, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but God knows when, if ever, China would happen. So let's get into some of the specifics. First of all, you list a dozen areas that you think would improve CPTPP from the U.S. perspective. I agree they would. But in some sense, they almost seem like a wish list. If we could have this, if we could have that. What makes you think that these Asian countries would be open to making the kind of concessions that you're proposing, and what sort of concessions might the U.S. make? I mean, Wendy, you negotiated TPP. Presumably, you would have wanted a lot of these provisions in there, and weren't able to because of the difficulty in concluding a trade deal. So, what makes you think that even if you had domestic support for moving ahead, that the Asian nations would be interested?
Well, first, as I mentioned at the outset, we have had some informal consultations with folks in certain TPP countries, including folks who still are in the government and some who are on the outside. And I was just encouraged by these discussions. We weren't negotiating, and they made it clear and we made it clear. But I sensed that based on those discussions, that there's a real openness to trying to deal with the types of issues that we would want to bring to the table, given their strong desire for the United States to get back into the CPTPP. So that's number one. Number two, I would just say, based on my experience as a trade negotiator, that once you take a first step in a trade negotiation, sometimes the second step then is easier. When you try to get it all at once, countries feel very threatened. There's a lot of uncertainty. And now the CPTPP has been in effect about 5 years. And I think folks are pretty comfortable with those provisions. And therefore, I would argue are ready kind of for a next step. And in fact, in some of these areas, particularly with respect to the green economy and to digital, CPTPP members are already talking among themselves about what more that they can do between themselves in these areas. So, some of these provisions would be a heavy lift. I don't disagree. But I came away from my discussions with CPTPP countries pretty optimistic.
Yeah, and Bob, if I can add to that, I mean, first of all, I would say the dynamic has changed. In many respects, I think we have more leverage than we had in the past. And there is real concern in the region about the role that China is playing and the lack of a role that the U.S. has been seen to be playing economically. And so there is so much interest in getting us back in that game to provide a counterweight that I think some of these countries are willing to do more than they otherwise would have. Now, I want to be more specific on one particular issue, and one of the issues that I acknowledge will be challenging, and that's rules of origin on autos, which is the first recommendation we have in our report. This is something that was very beneficial to Japan, that they saw as a key element to the original agreement. And basically what we recommend here is, in recognition of the importance of this issue to Japan, that we be flexible in how we would approach this. And in the first instance, what we would try to do would be to try to raise the standards across the agreement for all countries to a USMCA level standard. That's what we try to put on the negotiating table. We try to get Japan to accept that. But we recognize that there may be a scenario where other countries in the agreement, say Australia, are willing to go along with that, but Japan is not. And so what we basically say is, if you can't get everyone to agree, you can agree on a country by country basis. And then with respect to Japan, they wouldn't benefit from market access into the US market. And so really what you would have here is a flexible approach that recognizes the very specific sets of circumstances for each country and just tries to make it viable for us to get past those political differences. Now, an ideal scenario would be we could come up with something that they could live with. But the whole point is, we don't want to live or die on one issue. And so we try to build in flexibility to our recommendations so that where there are certain political sensitivities, we can get past that issue, and then we can get all the other good stuff that's going to come with having a free trade agreement with Japan.
Wendy, why don't you talk about that? You specifically negotiated with Japan, right? And this was the huge sticking point. So what would you see? Why did Japan, why was it so important to Japan in the first place? And why do you think that they might take a different position now?
Well, one thing we should keep in mind is that the tariff staging we have for our tariffs with Japan on cars, 25 years from entry into force, trucks, 30 years from entry into force. And so we fought hard for that long staging, which was unprecedented. One of Japan's key concerns with respect to automotive rules of origin, that in seeking a high rule of origin and keeping our long staging, we were saying, you're not going to be able to sell to the US market, but now we're going to lift your rule of origin. We're going to raise it when you want to trade with other Asian countries. So in terms of having a flexible approach, what we could be saying to a Japan, you can keep your rules for other Asian countries when you want to sell your cars within Asia, but when you want to sell to the United States, this is, we want to negotiate a higher rule of origin. And I think if it was cabined off like that, it would have a much better chance of receiving their acceptance. Also, I don't need to remind the viewers of all countries. I think Japan is the strongest in wanting us back into this agreement. And so I think flexibilities from Japan 6 years after our departure from TPP may be a lot stronger than they were in the initial negotiation.
Clete, you and Wendy both were talking about the impact of China, and maybe that changed the politics. What about the impact of Trump or Trumpism? The concern in Asia that, Trump could win re-election or somebody like him, in the sense of, a more protectionist, clearly a protectionist kind of mentality and a pugilistic kind of view toward China. I mean, how much do you think that plays in?
Well, I'm not sure, Bob. But what I will say is this: President Trump proudly signed the USMCA trade agreement, and that was seen as a major accomplishment. And what we're trying to do here is build on that. And I think the goal would be then to insulate the agreement from any future president, who wanted to, let me put it another way. The goal here would be to try to create a dynamic politically where future presidents who have the same view as President Trump would be happy with the agreement. Okay. And so that is the goal. Now, one of the provisions we deal with here that is unique is on the question of whether or not there should be a sunset. This was something we discussed and debated quite a bit. right? Because the sunset provision in USMCA says that that agreement will lapse at some period of time if countries, don't, if we don't reauthorize it. Now, we felt it was important for a subsequent president, whether it's President Trump, whether it's someone else, to be able to come in and review the agreement and to be able to say, like, there's things that we need to improve. And so what we do is we create a domestic process every 5 years where the U.S. government would review the agreement, make sure that it was, meeting our objectives, and then Congress would have a say on an expedited up or down vote after a period of time on whether that was the case. And the reason we do it through the domestic process legislatively is two reasons. Number one, we didn't feel like it was realistic to be able to go to these countries and say, hey, we want to join your agreement, but we're going to have a provision to make you all sunset your agreement that you're already a party to. That just didn't seem realistic. We also wanted to make sure Congress had more of a say. And there's been some concerns recently in the trade agenda that Congress has not had enough oversight over the process, and this would give Congress oversight. And then lastly, it would provide the leverage that we had hoped to get from utilizing some sort of sunset provision. So I think in many ways, hopefully it's an improvement. And the point I was starting to make, but I wanted to sort of come around to it, was about sort of insulating it from the U.S. political process. That is one of the problems with IPEF, of course, is it's not a congressionally approved agreement. We've seen some letters back and forth in recent weeks about that. But the whole idea would be we'd be going to a real trade agreement that was endorsed by the U.S. Congress, and therefore would require a subsequent administration to work with the U.S. Congress on any steps moving forward. And so I think that's actually a key feature of this as opposed to where we have an IPEF, and making sure we have a process to deal with it politically, but it's not so disruptive to the rest of the world that they can't rely upon it.
One of the more interesting proposals I thought was how you dealt with state-owned enterprises. As you were saying in TPP, there is a provision to treat them that state-owned enterprises must operate in a commercial fashion, right? And that was hard to get that in there, but clearly that's not sufficient. So, Wendy, how would you approach this issue? What more would you try to get, and why? And how would you convince countries like Vietnam to go along with it?
I think the key innovation that we're seeking with respect to state-owned enterprises is one we would lift from the USMCA, and that is really expanding the definition of what a state-owned enterprise is beyond just majority ownership, to more as any kind, as a level of control. And so that by definition would capture more state-owned enterprises and subject them to the rules, not only operating on a commercial basis, but their reporting requirements, transparency requirements, et cetera. The state-owned enterprise chapter has rules, and then it has annexes. And the annexes allow each country to negotiate certain flexibilities. If they want to phase in some of these disciplines for certain state-owned enterprises, then they negotiate to put that in the annex. So I think the flexible structure of the current CPTPP would allow for those negotiations with a country like Vietnam or Malaysia that has, a fair amount of state-owned enterprises.
And Clete, do you think, is the idea in the state-owned enterprise chapter to, one way I read it was, well, this is a way China would never be able to join. On the other hand, is it an idea that if somehow, China or say Vietnam was willing to, let's keep it to China. If China was actually willing, to live up to those, to make those kind of commitments, that it might be welcome in an agreement like this?
Well, our view, and as it's clearly spelled out in our report, is that China should not be allowed to enter this agreement, full stop. But I will say, I do think that getting this high standard provision, improving upon what was in TPP, looking at what we did in USMCA, is important because China is asserting its model around the region. trying to get others to follow its lead. And we want to create a standard that prohibits that and prevents that from happening. And so really the idea is to create a standard so other countries don't follow in China's footsteps, as well as allow us ultimately, to make that the norm internationally and to paint them as an international outlier. And I will just add quickly, Bob, since we're on the subject of China, that there are other things we look at doing that would be improvements over TPP. We look at adding in some of the things we got in the phase one deal around forced technology transfer, forced joint ventures. We're looking at some provisions around excess capacity. We're looking at ways we would do it through our legislation. We recommend looking at ways to improve our trade remedies measures. We didn't want to do that in the negotiation itself because there really isn't much of a trade remedies chapter, and rather trying to create that out of whole cloth. What we would do is we'd say, look, as part of the political deal here, we should look at some of the legislation like Brown-Portman that's out there on the Hill and see if we can embed that into our implementing legislation. Then the last a couple more, there's more China stuff, but one last one I'll highlight that I know Wendy was one of the big inspirations for was on economic coercion and making sure that countries can jointly act together to deal with China's economic coercion. So there's a lot that we do in here on China that I think would be an improvement over TPP and in many ways also an improvement even over USMCA.
So I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and there are some questions from the audience, which I'll get to. So on the, this is a sort of a China question too. I mean, the way you deal with subsidies and so on, which obviously is a concern about China, but I mean, you see now the United States is moving into a strong position on industrial policy, which includes subsidies. I mean, it's nowhere near the extent that China is or Vietnam or a lot of other countries, but still, or South Korea, but still, it is definitely moving in that direction. I think possible that a Republican, if Biden were, defeated by a Republican, that a Republican might still continue, that line. How would you work out a system? Well, presumably, I presume you want this, where the U.S. style subsidies are kosher, but something more than that isn't. So, Wendy, why don't you address that?
Well, Clete can correct me here, but my view is if you're going to discipline subsidies, you don't want to do it in a regional agreement or in a bilateral agreement necessarily. You want a multilateral agreement. Like, why would the TPP countries want to limit their ability to subsidize? China benefits from that and it can keep on subsidizing. So whether we like it or not, I think the WTO is really the main vehicle to, for rules on subsidies. I think what the TPP gets at subsidies through the behavior of state-owned enterprises. And I think that's kind of the correct vehicle to get at those practices.
No need to correct you, Wendy. I think you nailed it. And we talked about this in our working group. We talked about wanting to do something on industrial subsidies, but I think we realized because China is never going to be a member of this probably isn't the right fora to pursue that. And so I would just say to your question, Bob, nothing in here would tie our hands in our ability to pursue the path that we're pursuing, whether or not you like it or not.
So here's a question from the audience from Eric Hitor, if I didn't mispronounce his name. So he asked, how will pharmaceuticals be covered in your plan? Specifically, how do we ensure countries like India agree to IP protections the U.S. puts in place? How do we expect countries will push back on some of the quote unquote protections the U.S. enacts?
So this is, we get at this in the IP chapter. India isn't relevant here as it's not a member of the TPP. But one of the recommendations we have is that in the IP chapter, many folks may remember when we withdrew, there were how many, Wendy? 18, give or take 22?
22.
22. All right. I got it the second time. There were 22 IP provisions that were suspended that were basically U.S. offensive asks. And what we would recommend is that those we look at reinstating those because those would address sort of U.S. offensive interests with respect to that industry. Now, one important caveat here is we are not totally prescriptive on whether it has to be 22 of 22, 21 of 22. Obviously, I think we also want to let the U.S. political process work and make sure that, the provisions that are reinstated are provisions that have broad domestic political support in the United States. But there are 22 provisions there, including on IP for pharma, that we would look at.
Another question from the audience, Mara Lee. How do stakeholders keep the idea of reviving TPP relevant if there would also be no move to reopen negotiations until 2025? Also, I imagine this one's for you, Clete. Also, do you think a President DeSantis would be open to such an approach? Good luck on that one.
Let me say, I'm encouraged by the conversations I've had with Republicans. And I don't think we want to overstate the fact that, President Trump did decide to withdraw from this agreement. But like I said, I was in the Oval Office with him talking about whether that was the right move and whether or not we would want to try to renegotiate it. And I think if we could be successful and if we could do a lot of what we're trying to do in this report, I think everyone across the political spectrum should support it, because I think it actually marries very well some of the importance of trade agreements to promote our offensive interests, to promote agricultural exports, including from Florida. While at the same time adding in those important protections that President Trump authorized with USMCA. So I'd love to talk to Ron DeSantis if he runs for president about this, but we'll leave that to another time. What was the other question?
I can take the other question, I think, is
Sure.
if we wouldn't even be ready to look at this till 2025, how do we keep this conversation alive? And, and this is from an old colleague, a former USTR colleague of mine, Mara. So hi, Mara. Things take time, and it takes time to socialize things. And again, when we look at this paper, we're looking at beginning a conversation. IPEF is underway now. Hopefully we'll see some concrete results coming out of this initiative within the year. If we successfully start a conversation, then that is going to take time for these issues to percolate and to be socialized. So I don't see. This isn't going to happen in the immediate term. So I think we are talking about the medium term, and 2025 doesn't seem that far off, frankly.
So let's talk about economic coercion. I find this a really interesting area. China really obviously is pushing on that quite a bit. Your proposal is, the way I read it anyway, basically talks about naming and shaming, condemning, presumably would be China. And the Trump administration, Matt Pottinger, the NSC, tried to go well beyond that and put together an economic version of NATO where members would buy goods that China's boycotting. Interesting idea, but it never went anywhere. Clete, I wonder, first off, if you were involved in any of that, and maybe could give us an update as to why, a more aggressive policy didn't go anywhere.
Well, so I think I was out of the White House when those conversations happened. So I can't speak to sort of the historical evolution. But I will say in putting this together, we were inspired by those concepts. We think they're a good idea. And I think the idea here, would really be twofold. On one hand, we would look at offensive tools that we would use to take action against China, for example, if it is pursuing economic and trade coercion against one of these members. And then on the other hand, we would also look at ways that we could assist other member countries, so we would be pushing back on one hand and then assisting them in figuring out different ways where we could help them get through a period of time where their products are being discriminated against with China. And that's the idea. And so all I can say, Bob, is look, I wasn't part of those in the White House, but we were inspired by the concepts that Matt and others put forward and think they have some merit.
And just if I can add, I think our conclusion also was there was no one size fits all for every coercive act that's taken. And so what we're recommending is we have almost like two toolboxes. One would be actions we could take, depending on the circumstance, against the country practicing coercion, but also tools, as Clete said, that could be used to assist the country that's being coerced. And, that could differ from a Lithuania to an Australia, to a Korea, to other countries. And so I think this kind of flexible approach, but providing tools that could be used is really the way to go here. But I will just say, hats off to CPTPP countries, because beyond talking just about, countries who want to exceed need to live up to high standards, they're also now emphasizing those countries or economies need a track record of implementing and living up to their commitments under trade agreements. And what we have seen from China, it is a free trade agreement with Australia. It is a free trade agreement with Korea. And yet, it can just turn off trade for non-trade reasons. And, what's the value of the piece of paper? And so we think coercion is an issue that needs to be addressed in the TPP or in any trade agreement going forward, because it really jeopardizes the value of the trade agreement if left unspoken for.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. It just seems that from my conversations, the last thing a lot of these countries in Asia want is to be caught between the United States and China, and that it would be a very difficult area to get a public kind of agreement.
Okay. And I agree. And so maybe one of those countries says, you know what, we want to be quiet vis-a-vis China, but what would really help us is, if you can expedite a product approval for a certain agricultural product, based on science. But in other words, have the conversation about how we can help them in light of that coercion, if that's what they're looking for, but not forcing them to, be out there with us on China if they don't want to be.
Bob, I would answer your question a different way and say they're already caught in the middle. And the question is whether we're going to step in and actually provide them with assistance. And in both in terms of this economic coercion kind of issue, as well as the agreement more broadly. And these are countries who are having to make tough decisions about supply chains, trying to figure out are they going to link more closely with the United States, or are they going to link more closely with China? And we need to put real carrots on the table that are going to help them link more closely with the United States. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here.
Let me, another one from the audience. I'm looking at the time. This might be our last question. Said historically, the business community has partnered with the administration and Congress in pushing trade agreements forward. I'm going to make a little modification on the question. So first of all, do you see, have you been talking to business groups? Are you trying to put together a group of business groups? And also, let me ask, would that even be a positive way of going forward? Or would it be just seen as, another business roundtable effort? So how do you kind of work with outsiders? That would be a useful way of going forward.
Well, I would say that we made strong efforts to consult with a range of stakeholders throughout this process. And as you'll see reflected in our recommendations, there's quite a few things in there that things from the folks from the labor or environmental community would like. But I would also argue there's a lot in there that the business community will find very valuable as well. We haven't spent a ton of time talking about, the fact that this will change the tariff differentials that our companies are paying in the region. It will eliminate the disadvantage that they have vis-a-vis China for ag products, for manufacturing projects and things like that. I think there's a lot on IP, on digital, on supply chains that will be valuable. So to your point, Bob, I think this is a balanced attempt that would address some of their concerns as well as others, from other parts of the spectrum. Now, in terms of whether or not we put a coalition together, I think we're just trying to start this conversation. I think we hope it picks up steam. And if at a later date there is an opportunity for a broad range of stakeholders to come together and push that, I think that would be fantastic. But that might be putting the cart before the horse right now.
I guess we have time for one more. So this is from Niels Graham of the Atlantic Council, which again, I'm going to modify a little bit. He asked whether, he's talking about IPEF and whether more countries should be added like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand. So I'll extend that to your idea. I mean, who else should be involved? In particular, would you think it's a good idea to invite Taiwan to be part of this when China won't be part of it?
Are you letting me answer, Wendy? Well, let's say, look, I think the possibility of adding countries to this agreement is a real plus. Countries or economies to this agreement is a real plus. I'm super excited about the United Kingdom and many others. Now, personally, I think we should be doing everything we can to link our economy with Taiwan, and I'd love to see us do more with them. Whether or not this is the right fora or not is probably a broad geopolitical issue that we need to discuss. So I don't want to speak for Wendy. I'm open to enhanced engagement with Taiwan, however we can do it. But we didn't tackle that explicitly in our recommendations.
Mm-hmm. But I will say the agreement is explicit. It's not just open to countries. It's open to customs territories like the WTO, like APEC, et cetera. And so the CPTPP countries, as I mentioned, as soon as the UK accession is over, they're going to have some really tough decisions to make.
We're just a few minutes from 3 o'clock. I think I'll turn it back to Wendy. And again, I think it's just been a very fascinating report and a great way to start a conversation.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Bob, for moderating. Thank you to my partner, Clete, for co-authoring this paper and defending it so well. From the Asia Society Policy Institute, we urge you to read the paper. You can access it on our website. We hope we can continue the conversation with you. We hope this starts the conversation. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.